Thank you, thank you. Hello, Thailand. How are you guys doing? Wonderful to be here. How many people have watched this movie? Let's see a show of hands. Okay, great, great. I'm not going to spoil the movie for those of you who have not watched it, but if you remember, what unit does this guy work at? He worked at the police force, but that unit had a name. Do you remember what was it? Pre-crime, exactly, pre-crime. He worked at a place called Pre-Crime Unit, and effectively the function of this police force was to look at a person and say, I think you're going to commit a crime in the future. I'm going to arrest you today. So a group of Chinese researchers watched the movie. They liked it. They were like, why don't we try it? They did. They fed 1,891 images of criminals and non-criminals to an AI. Here are examples. Top 3, gentlemen, are examples of criminals. Bottom 3 are non-criminals. By the end of this training process, the AI could look at a single image of a person and predict criminality with 89.5% accuracy. I have the app on my phone. We're going to try it right now. We're not going to try it right now. All right. Who has heard of this brand? Who knows what this brand is? Care to admit publicly? This is Ashley Madison. Ashley Madison is an online dating website for married people after they're married. Somebody's writing it down. It's ashleymadison.com. ashleymadison.com. Before you sign up, though, let me tell you, there was a big hack of the database. You probably heard. And to this day, we know that up to 4 men have committed suicide because their names were implicated in the database. Looking at the same database, we know that the ratio of active male to female users on the website was 20 million to 1,500. $20 million men for 1,500 women. Really, an aspirational website. So. Now, would those men have committed suicide if they had known? Would they have even signed up? Probably not. Probably not. The average person in Thailand makes just over $300 a month. These guys made over $300 million every month that they worked together. $300 million a month. They worked together for 5 years and they sold a company to Facebook. Anybody know what they sold? WhatsApp. Yeah, they sold WhatsApp for $19 billion. The point here is that because of exponential technologies, a lot of our assumptions about how economies function, how business models operate, and how individuals optimize their choices no longer seem to hold true. We need to revisit these assumptions. We call this field exponential economics or exonomics. And in the time we have today, I want to share with you some of the highlights from our research. We talk about 7 areas, the so-called 7 pillars of exonomics: people, property, production, price, power, policy, and prosperity. And I always like to point out that this is a journey that connects people to prosperity. That's very much intentional. That is why we're here. That is the spirit of this conversation. So let's jump right in. If we zoom out and look at the big picture, we live in an amazing world. Human life expectancy in the last 100 years has doubled. We have integrated circuits that are 30,000 times faster than when they were invented. Solar panels are 250 times cheaper than 1975. And DNA sequencing is more than 100,000 times cheaper. Now, biotechnology, nanotechnology, and information technology are growing exponentially. But the part that we rarely talk about is the following fact. The fact is, exponential technologies create exponential winners and exponential losers. Right? There are 2 sides to this story. And we need to understand how society as a whole is impacted, how individuals are impacted, but of course how businesses are impacted. How do we end up as winners and not losers, but also take care of the losers that this wave of technological change produces? Let me illustrate what I mean by winners and losers. I want you to visualize 10 seconds. Count to 10 seconds with me in your head. Let's do that together right now. In those 10 seconds, Google made $17,000. Apple made $55,000. In those 10 seconds, more than 40,000 hours of videos were watched on Netflix in merely 10 seconds. But also in the same 10 seconds, there's a flip side to this story. The average person in the world made 0.2 tenths of a second. 19 children were born into poverty. We threw away 418 tons of food. And 3 people died of starvation in those 10 seconds. If you look at net productivity over the last 70 years, that's the blue line. You can see a steady increase in the last 70 years, as I mentioned. But the red line, real hourly compensation, when you adjust wages for inflation, that's pretty stagnant in the last 40 years. This is a problem. This means that there's unequal exposure to the benefits of technology. Depending on which wave you're catching, your life is very, very different. I'm showing you US data here, but we've looked at many different countries. This gap seems to be correlated with the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality in a society. Our nightmare scenario is when economic inequality translates into genetic inequality, translates into longevity inequality. What would the world look like if we end up with that world? Now, collectively, we should worry about this, species bifurcation. This is where humanity is going to split into subspecies and evolve differently depending on what type of access people have to these technologies. This is quite scary, quite scary. Let's look at the share of total wealth of different countries that the top 1% take away. It turns out Thailand is the 3rd most unequal country in the world. So that bifurcation is already beginning. This is a problem. This is a huge problem. And the problem is not just with individuals or businesses, whoever is here today. The problem is intergenerational. There's evidence that this propagates itself over many different generations. You probably have heard of the marshmallow test. How many people have heard of the marshmallow test? Great, great. Effectively, the marshmallow test is the following. You put a marshmallow in front of a kid, and you say, don't eat it. Well, you say, wait 15 minutes, and I'll give you another one. And it's supposed to test the child's ability to postpone gratification. And there was a famous study published that showed that the better a child could postpone gratification, the more they were successful later in life, both financially, academically, all sorts of indicators. This study was replicated recently. The results were published 2 weeks ago. It turns out, the moment you take into account family wealth, there is no marshmallow effect. It's completely explained away. Meaning, if you're from a rich family, it doesn't matter if you eat the marshmallow or not. You'll be fine. Think about that. Now, there's a very interesting phenomenon that we've come across in our research. All around the world, if you look at the share of national income that the top 10% of earners take away, in every single country, this trend shows up. We have a downward trend up until around 1980, and then an upward trend. This is highly consistent. So it begs the question, what happened right around 1980? Of course, the personal computer was invented. You could argue that exponential technologies took off right around here. The point here is that exponential technologies have a bifurcating effect. And so far, we have seen nothing. In fact, we think the next decade is going to be dominated by what we call the 4 supremacies. We're going to remember the next decade for quantum supremacy, blockchain supremacy, solar supremacy, and AI supremacy. Blockchain supremacy you already heard about. Quantum supremacy is when quantum computers become superior to digital computers. Solar supremacy is when the marginal cost of solar surpasses everything else, and we already seem to be getting there. The marginal cost of energy going all the way to zero. And AI supremacy you've heard about as well, when AI surpasses humans in a lot of applications. In fact, these forces are going to be so massive in the next decade that we think the next decade will be remembered as the Great Bifurcation. In the book we're writing, this is the subtitle of our book, The Great Bifurcation. We've had great recessions, Great Depression. The next decade is going to be the great bifurcation because these technologies will impact individuals, businesses, and entire societies very, very differently. The first sentence of the book is the following. We have written this book in the hope that its main prediction will not come true. I think we all have a role to play in this. And now is the time to talk about it because we can potentially control how this plays out. But perhaps the most common question that I get is, all right, the great bifurcation is coming. How do I end up on the right side of the bifurcation? So let's talk about that for a second. Specifically, I want to share with you 20 ideas for becoming an exponential winner. This is in the context of business, but we will also talk about the role of governments as to how they might protect those who are not so lucky. Let's jump right in. In order to win in this new world, first of all, you need to understand new drivers of value. I have 3 suggestions for you. Number 1, ask yourself the following question about any product or service. Whether the virtual, digital, connected version of it exists. If not, go build it immediately. That's an immediate business opportunity. We also talk about the Uberization of many different industries. The fact that people want what they want exactly when they want it. Just-in-time delivery is a huge source of value. And finally, the marginal cost of production is dropping. In fact, in a lot of industries, the marginal cost of production, the marginal cost of producing 1 additional unit of product or service has gone all the way to 0, or is approaching it. If that is true, then it doesn't cost as much to hyper-customize your offering. And effectively, you can go after the long tail of the market with hyper-customized products or services. In this case, I think the 3D printed version of this guy looks better than him. Just pointing that out. Let's say you've decided how to create value. The next question is, how will you price it? In order to answer that question, here's the world's most famous graph. Supply, demand, the intersection gives us market price. Not anymore. Not anymore. Thanks to the fact that the marginal cost of supply is dropping so much, suddenly the entire area under the demand curve is serviceable. Translation, you should sell your product or service for a different price point depending on who's buying it, why they're buying it, and when they're buying it. Dynamic pricing is the name of the game. It used to be you could go online and pay the same price as everybody else. Not anymore. And I think the nightmare scenario is when you're in a physical store, you approach the shelf, you'll say you're in a grocery store, and as you reach for the tomato, the prices go up right in front of your eyes. How annoying would that be? There are startups that are working on affluence detection based on how you walk, what you look like, and what you're wearing. So watch out for this very annoying future. Another factor to understand in this new world is the rise of what we call nanoeconomics. We have good models for macroeconomics, microeconomics. Now we're seeing nanoeconomics. The smallest unit of work has shrunk. Thanks to exponential technologies, we've never been able to better measure incremental economic value creation like we do today. Translation, here are some of the platforms where you can hire somebody for less than $5. This was never possible before. It means that more and more people are behaving entrepreneurially. It also means that more people are exposed to the downside of the market. But that's another topic. At the core of nanoeconomics and the revolution behind it, we think is going to be cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology behind crypto. Mandy did an amazing job explaining all of this stuff, so I will not go into the details. But I'll mention this. The most exciting aspect of cryptocurrencies, of course, as Mandy mentioned, is the blockchain. And in order to understand the blockchain, I think the way contracts are going to be redefined, the way we no longer will need trust and enforcement to have a contract with somebody, because both of these will be automated with the blockchain. That is quite exciting. And the example that I always like to share is this. You're driving on the highway. There's a lot of traffic. What if your car could start offering tiny amounts of Bitcoin to all the cars in the front and ask them to clear the lane? Why not? We have the infrastructure for this, but as Mandy mentioned, the network effects are not there, but they will be there. And we will come back to this theme of nanotransactions and nanoeconomics a bit later. But let me ask you a question. If the world's largest retailer, Alibaba, does not own any inventory, none whatsoever, what is something that the world's most disruptive insert your business type might no longer need? What is something that you hold to be a core asset to your business model that might no longer be necessary in this new world? I did this exercise with a group of bankers. It took us about an hour, but the group emerged convinced that the world's most disruptive bank might not need to have money as its core asset. the concept of money. It needs the infrastructure for the flow of money, but money itself might no longer be core. So I urge you to reflect on this question with your own business model. And the conversation that we have coming up with Mohit about the sharing economy will be quite illuminating. But here's another question. If cars are going to be driving themselves and you can Uber them whatever you need to, what could this potentially do to real estate prices? Think about it. It should go down. Here's why. If people don't mind staying in the car a bit longer because their time in the car is productive, right? They can watch that movie, they can rest, they can get work done. Well, they don't mind staying in the car a bit longer, and they're going to start living a little further and further away. Supply of viable real estate goes up, demand is the same. We should see asset price compression. In markets where Uber is very active, there is already evidence that this is happening. If you drive outside of Amsterdam for about 15 minutes, real estate prices drop by more than 50%. And I think the world's first self-driving car has already demonstrated this. There's precedent for this. What was the world's first self-driving car? I think it was the elevator. The elevator, really, think about it. It's a self-driving car. The elevator made us indifferent to distance. You don't care which floor you live on. You don't try to be as close as possible to the ground floor. What the elevator did vertically, self-driving cars are going to do horizontally. And it could be quite interesting. Property dynamics in summary. Ownership seems to be going down, and we'll talk about that a bit later in the next session. Virtualization is on the rise, decentralization is on the rise, and production cost is dropping. If these are true, then we're headed towards a very serious oversupply scenario. Right? And depending on which industry you're in, you've already noticed oversupply. So the question is, how do you survive and thrive in a world of oversupply? What are your drivers of value? What is the driver of your market power? So let's talk about market power. Specifically, 4 types of businesses that you could be in. The first type of business you could be in is a content business. If you're in the content business, you do not have a lot of market power. Why? Because content has been digitized, and the marginal cost of copying content has gone all the way to 0. Right? You don't pay anything to copy that one file. It doesn't mean you don't make money as a content business. It simply means that you do not have a lot of market power as a content business. If you go further up the power chain, you end up where most of us live. We offer products and services to the world. We have more market power than a content business, but less market power than a platform. What is a platform? The term platform has truly been misused and abused, so let me share with you our definition of it. We define a platform as a value bridge. You're creating a bridge to connect multiple sides of the market. Most importantly, you should resist the temptation to become one side of the market. Quite often, when we work with companies who are trying to build a platform, they build the bridge and then they cross it and they're like, we're this side of the market. No, you truly want to leave it as a bridge. And finally, what happens when you interlock multiple platforms? Very hard to do. Many technology companies are trying to do this, but you end up with an ecosystem. The best example, and quite possibly the only example of a true ecosystem of interlocking platforms that we could find today is WeChat out of China. WeChat. Highly recommend you look into their model if you haven't already. Let me show you the S&P 500 index. This is the S&P Standard & Poor's index of the 500 largest companies in the United States. On the right-hand side, you have a random sampling of companies in the index that have left since 2002. And on the left-hand side, you have a random sampling of entries into the index since 2002. If you look at the right-hand side, you notice that the vast majority of these companies are product or service companies. But if you look at the left-hand side, you notice that there are many examples of platforms. We have Priceline, eBay, E-Trade, Salesforce, Netflix, Amazon, Google, and the list goes on. So platform wars are coming, and we all need a strategy. But let me share with you the 5th business type that we have identified in our research for the book. Normally, I don't talk about it at summits, but I thought I'd share with you guys today. We call this the operating system business model, the operating system. We've seen version 1, the very early version of the operating system business model. Typically, the example that comes to mind is Microsoft Windows. But that's version 1. Here we're talking about version 2, where you're an invisible platform in the background connecting multiple technologies to multiple sides of the market. To this day, we do not really have an example of an operating system business model, but we think in the next decade we're going to see many, many examples of these. Let me show you what the operating system concept looks like in practice. The most important distinction to make as we dive into this is the distinction between collaboration and coordination. Collaboration and coordination. Let me show you collaboration. Here is a bunch of people in 1907. This is San Francisco. A bunch of people collaborating not to die. It's an excellent example of collaboration. Wait for the horse. Here we go. The car was just introduced to the roads, and it is utter chaos, loss of collaboration. But contrast this picture with what we have today. In this image, nobody is collaborating. Instead, everybody is hyper-coordinated, right? There is no collaboration. In fact, when you have accidents, it's typically because somebody got cute and tried to collaborate. What is allowing us to coordinate at this level? It's right in front of us. We call this the operating system, the exponential operating system. In this case, is the traffic light. The traffic light was invented in 1910. Most cities in the world did not get one until the year 1920. But why did we suddenly need this exponential operating system? Here's why. Between the year 1900 and 1920, the number of cars on the road went from 8,000 to 8 million. That's a truly exponential growth curve. As the complexity of the system goes up, and this is something we see again and again, collaboration is no longer feasible. So we see systems migrate away from collaboration towards coordination. Collaboration zone, coordination zone, right after the knee of the curve. And there are many examples of this in our lives. Let me give you an example. How many people today feel like they get too many emails? Okay, keep those hands up. Thank you. So first of all, everybody else, stop emailing these people. That's the first step towards a solution. But I think we're going to look back at this period in human history and recognize that email was a form of collaborative communication. And as the complexity has gone up, we're noticing that there's latent demand for coordinated communication. Platforms like Slack, that's what they're offering. So it's very interesting because collaboration is a scary zone. In fact, a lot of mistakes happen in collaboration. We've looked at airline accidents. It turns out that more than 76% of airline accidents happen on the first day of a crew working together. They're squarely in the collaboration zone before they find a mechanism to help themselves coordinate. And in fact, throughout human history, as these systems gain in complexity, somebody shows up very consistently inventing an exponential operating system that allows the system to migrate. That's what Edison, Ford, and Steve Jobs did. And when you hear about technologies like CRISPR and biotech, deep learning and AI, and the blockchain, these are also exponential operating systems that allow us to move away from collaboration and embrace new complexity through coordination. But let me show you what this would look like with teams.
But Holland comes in for a pit stop. Time to refuel and change tires. Lou Moore himself changes the tires. Only 4 crew members, including the driver, are allowed to work on the car. It's a tense time. Holland stays in his seat, anxious to get away. Let's watch. Tires are changed at last. A crewman polishes the windshield as Holland moves away just 67 seconds after he stopped.
Just 67 seconds, more like a year. So this is 1.92 seconds. It's the world record right now. We've looked at systems that have these types of dynamics, and they tend to have three key attributes. We call these exponential system dynamics. These are highly adaptable, scalable, and self-manageable systems. Adaptability we'll talk about in a second, but scalability. If you wanted 10 pit stops, all you need to do is to replicate whatever these guys are doing, build 10 different pit stops, and every person from this team would know how to function. So these are highly scalable systems. Self-manageability. Notice there is no manager here. Everybody is managing themselves. And this is something that we see again and again in Silicon Valley startups, but also larger companies that are embracing rapid-paced innovation. Because management is slow, it creates a lot of friction, and quite frankly, it's passive-aggressive. But self-management, if you empower individuals to manage themselves, that's how you get exponential dynamics. But perhaps most importantly, again, in this image, notice that nobody is collaborating. There is no time for collaboration. Instead, everybody is hyper-coordinated. The point here is not to, and by the way, let's be very honest about this. Modern management science has taught us to collaborate, right? For the last 80 years or so, the high watermark of how you would manage a team is how well you help them collaborate with each other. But here's the problem. If you ask people anonymously, 73% of people report preferring to work alone to working in teams. So we have a problem. And we think it has a lot to do with collaboration versus coordination. But what would this look like, this concept of an exponential operating system as a business model? To demonstrate, I want to show you this video. This is from Project YOLO. YOLO stands for You Only Look Once. It's an AI project. They have trained an AI to look at a video for the first time, and as it is watching it with you, the AI is trying to detect objects in the video. So in this case, here is a person, here's a motorbike that are being detected in real time. So, of course, right off the bat, you notice that this rate of object detection is faster than the human brain can handle, right? Already, this is evident. So AI supremacy in this domain has already established. But I want you to reflect on the following question. If we have this type of AI, if we have IoT, if we have the blockchain, what types of nanotransactions could we expect? Let me pause right here. Think about what just happened. What kinds of nanotransactions could we expect? What would the nano-economic version of this world look like? So she just fired her gun. Immediately, her gun license fee went up by about 7%. That happened in real time. The guy who's jumping over the bridge here, before hitting the ground, an ambulance is already called, an insurance claim is already made, and the ambulance is on its way. All these people in line of fire, assuming this is the United States of America, their lives have been endangered. So they have sued her agency. The lawsuit is settled automatically. The money is already in their accounts. They're all enrolled in therapy. It starts next Thursday. Insurance premiums for this yellow car just went up by about 10%. Real estate in this whole neighborhood just dropped by about 20%. And all of that happened in real time. It sounds like science fiction to us today, but we think in the next decade, this is exactly the world we're headed towards. If you look at human history, a very consistent trend is that the number of transactions that the typical person engages in on a daily basis has been growing exponentially. And the minimum transaction size has been dropping exponentially. So this is right on cue, this world of nanoeconomics. And we think we're going to reflect on nanoeconomics in terms of a new invention that is not here yet. We call this BlakeNet. BlakeNet stands for blockchain, AI, and quantum. We think these three forces that are going to come into effect in the next decade are going to be incredibly powerful for the types of transactions that they will enable. In BlakeNet, blockchain, AI, and quantum, accountability is going to be accomplished through the blockchain, automation through AI, and optimization at levels we have never seen before through quantum computing. And quantum computing, by all indications, should be 5 to 7 years away. In fact, the BlakeNet, and who knows, the name is probably not going to stick, we don't care, but BlakeNet will be so disruptive that we draw this analogy. We think BlakeNet will do to the internet what the internet did to the library. So this is something to embrace. And now is the time to ask yourself, how will your business model survive and thrive with the emergence of the BlakeNet? Now is the time. In the world that we're describing, there's a lot of uncertainty. And the vast majority of companies, individuals, societies in general, gravitate towards IQ the moment you have uncertainty in a system. As a response to this crazy, hectic world, we gravitate towards intelligence. We try to surround ourselves with very smart people. We build very intelligent teams. But the problem is recent research has shown that beyond the first 2 years on the job, IQ does not seem to predict success. Let me say that again. IQ does not seem to be predicting success. So what are we missing? With a group of researchers at T-Labs, I've invented the concept of AQ for adaptability quotient. If the world is growing exponentially and all this change is happening, your ability to respond to that change is the strongest predictor of your success. IQ still matters, but we believe in a stacked model of intelligence. You have IQ, on top of that you have EQ, emotional intelligence, and then you have AQ for adaptability. And we're trying to develop a tool that helps us quantify AQ. Just like you can measure your IQ, we're trying to develop a mechanism, a psychometric tool, that helps you measure your own AQ. As part of this research, we bring people into the lab and we say, hey, welcome. Today we're going to measure your adaptability. What do you think happens? They start behaving more adaptively, which is very annoying because we're trying to measure the thing. But I think it's fantastic news for humanity. It means that unlike IQ, AQ seems to be coachable, highly coachable. You're not stuck with it. You can develop it. And there's a message in there. We've talked to many individuals, many teams, many organizations. We've noticed that the common denominator across everybody is that we're all searching for stability. But the strongest predictor of how much stability you will enjoy seems to be how well you can unlearn. Unlearning is emerging as a new core competency in this new world of exponential change. Your ability to unlearn predicts your AQ, predicts your adaptive response to it. But the problem is we have never been taught how to unlearn. Our education system is predicated on the dumping of a lot of information on a lot of people in the image of the Industrial Revolution. We're never really taught how to unlearn. In fact, after these types of conversations, I noticed that a lot of executives go back to their teams and they say, listen, the world is changing exponentially fast. We need to unlearn A, B, and C. Go do it yesterday. We become very prescriptive with unlearning. But the problem is unlearning is actually very, very difficult. And I would love for all of us to approach unlearning, especially with our teams, quite sympathetically, ideally empathetically. So I want to give you a visual reminder of what unlearning looks like. Somebody invented a bike that turns left when you turn the handle right. Here are some people who are being offered $100 to ride this bike for 1 meter only. So nobody can do it. The guy in blue, his name is Destin Sandlin. He taught himself. How long do you think it took him? Any guesses? Did I hear 1 hour? Longer. A day? Even longer, but that's a pretty exponential guess. It took him 8 months, on average 45 minutes a day, to be able to do this. Eight months, 45 minutes a day. That's time well spent. And even then, it's not very stable. Now, Destin has a son. At the time, the son was 5. How long do you think it took the son? 2 weeks. It took the son 2 weeks instead of 8 months, 45 minutes a day. What do you think happened when he tried to get back on a regular bike? It looks funny, doesn't it? I always joke that I have never done anything well that I hadn't done badly first. I think the leadership moment for all of us is to understand that our role is to create a safe space for people to get the badly done first out of the way. In this new world, we need to do a lot of unlearning, and we need to empower each other to do it with the safety of the environment we're in. So I would love for all of us to approach unlearning sympathetically, ideally empathetically. I promised I would tell you a little bit about what governments are doing and what they could be doing. So let's switch gears to the next pillar of Exonomics and talk about policy. Specifically, the D word. Let's start with the D word. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Deflation. What do you get when you print a lot of money? You're supposed to get inflation. Where is the inflation? There's currently around $7 trillion of negative yielding government bonds in circulation. Governments have been printing a lot of money. They call it quantitative easing. Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, the Fed in the United States. Everybody has been doing quantitative easing in pursuit of healthy inflation. Every single region is below target. Every single region is below target. So what is going on here? There are people in Denmark, by the way, who are getting paid to repay their mortgage because of negative interest rates. So what's going on with the world of monetary policy? I think on one hand, we have governments who are trying to print a lot of money in pursuit of healthy inflation. But on the other hand, we have technological deflation. These technologies are making things cheaper, faster, and more accessible. And they're counterbalancing the inflationary forces that you get from printing a lot of money. In your own country, in Thailand, both core and headline inflation are below target. And the trend is downward. We think that we're going to look back at this period in human history and recognize it as a demarcation between the inflationary era and the deflationary era. Because exponential technologies are making things cheaper, faster, and more accessible. And that's a good thing, because if you're trying to solve cancer, wouldn't you love deflation? It means you go to bed, you wake up, everything is cheaper. You can run more experiments. In fact, deflation is the mother of innovation, but we've been taught to fear it. We think we're going to overcome that fear and eventually arrive at an interesting place. The transition, by the way, from an inflationary environment to a deflationary environment can be scary, mainly because of debt. But that's a longer conversation. Nevertheless, we will get there. Here's another area with major implications for policy: self-driving cars. We will have self-driving cars, and I believe much sooner than most people realize. In fact, the vast majority of companies in the world that are building self-driving cars, for some reason, they like to test them near where I live, in Palo Alto, in California. So almost every day, I drive next to self-driving cars. And every time I see a self-driving car next to me, I do this. I'm helping with the training of the AI. I'm doing my part. I don't do that. But when we have self-driving cars, a few things will happen. Number one, we're going to dramatically reduce car accidents. Already, these cars are orders of magnitude safer than the average human driver. In fact, you probably heard about the tragic accident about a month and a half ago in Arizona when the Uber self-driving car killed that woman. The part that is not reported in the media is that if you combine the total number of miles and kilometers that these cars have driven in self-driving mode, and you substitute a human driver, by now more than 100 people should have been killed. Instead, one person has died. And that mistake will never be replicated, will never be repeated. Every car in the world just got upgraded. So already dramatically reducing car accidents and injuries is within our reach. When we have self-driving cars, we're also going to have a whole bunch of unemployed drivers. Bus drivers, taxi drivers, you name it, truck drivers. And car ownership will also go down. In markets where Uber is very active, there's already evidence that this is happening. Because you're interested in the ride, not necessarily the car. You'll hear more about this in the sharing economy session. Let's put some numbers on these. Unemployed drivers, that's about 1% of the workforce in most countries. Reduced car ownership, that's about 2% of GDP. And this part kills me. 3% of the GDP in most countries comes from the death and destruction of car accidents. 3%. That's ridiculous. And it should go away. It will. It will. In fact, I always like to say, what do wars, dental cavities, and car accidents have in common? To contribute to the GDP. So there is evidence that exponential technologies will actually compress GDP. If you solve cancer, by the way, you will destroy GDP. But perfect, do it, go for it. Let's add these numbers. That's 5% of GDP and 1% of the workforce who is extremely angry. Good luck retraining them. Let me tell you, I met 3 prime ministers last year and had one-on-one conversations. None of them are prepared for this picture. This is systemic. Too much is happening too quickly. Because here's the nightmare scenario. This is a soup line from the Great Depression. Nightmare scenario back then, in the 1930s. Nightmare scenario today is a robot telling you there are no more jobs available. And this will happen. So what should we do? We will talk about the future of work, but I want to share with you what Martin Luther King had to say about this. He said, "I am now convinced that the simplest solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by..." Anybody know what he said? Universal basic income. He wrote a book about UBI. UBI is giving free money away to everybody to cover their basic needs. Now, how many people believe that the moment you give away free money to everybody to cover their basic needs, society as a whole is going to become lazier? Let's see a show of hands. All right, it's a fair assumption. In the US, many more hands go up, but it's a fair assumption. That's why we need to look at the effect of UBI. We've never really had UBI introduced to our societies. Currently, there are more than 30 studies looking at the effect of UBI on a local community, and almost without exception, the finding is this. These studies report a jump in entrepreneurship. Quite often, the number that is reported is 3-fold increase in entrepreneurship. So UBI, and this theme of technological unemployment, merits a much longer conversation. But my team's belief is that by the year 2030, every country on the planet will have had a public debate about UBI. Where we land on that question is very unpredictable today. In fact, it's political suicide in most countries to even bring it up. But this is going to gain urgency with the great bifurcation in the next decade. Because ultimately, you can try to summarize 10,000 years of economic history on one slide. Very ambitious. Let me do it in one sentence. I think it's about adding certainty to an uncertain world. Every economic system in human history has rewarded those who have added certainty against a backdrop of uncertainty. And in our world, there's no better measure of this. Extreme poverty, for the first time in human history, has fallen below 20%. And I think that's fantastic. We're moving in the right direction. But let's be very clear about something. While poverty is going down and the poor are getting richer, the rich are getting mega rich. Why is this a problem? Effectively, extreme poverty has gone down, but relative poverty is going up. The problem is, as a species, we're very bad at handling relative poverty. We're horrible at it. Let me give you an example, a very concrete example. You've probably had the experience of embarking on a plane, going on a plane, and walking past the business class. Right? You've had that. A recent study has shown that this experience of walking past business class and going to your economy seat, on flights where people have to do that, the incidence of air rage jumped by 218%. People don't like it. People don't like it. When you perceive class difference, you have a problem. And people tend to react to this. And in fact, there's a history lesson in all of this for us. Throughout human history, humans have never overcome extreme inequality, economic inequality, without violence. We've never overcome extreme economic inequality without violence. So this is a cautionary tale. We all have to tune into this now. Before I show you this video, which is my final point about policy, let's go through an exercise together. And I apologize, it's a bit of a morbid exercise, but stay with me. There's a point to the exercise. I want you to think about everybody you know. Friends, family members, colleagues, everybody you know. And ask yourself a simple question. How will these people die? I know it's unpleasant, but stay with it for a second. We have a statistical answer to the question you just thought about. More than half of the people you just thought about will die from some form of cardiovascular failure. All right? Now have a look at this amazing new technology. Here is the global military spend. Here's the budget for this project. Here's the number of times you can attempt to solve a problem that is going to kill more than half of us in this room. Why is this not happening? Why is there such a misallocation of human potential, human creativity, human resources? I think we all have a role to play in this, to upgrade our collective imagination. Because let me tell you, no innovation in human history has taken 2 million attempts. Usually we figure it out way sooner. All right, right around here I like to check in with everybody to see how you're all feeling. How many people right now feel like this? Hold on, that's it? So everybody else, you kind of feel like this? Yeah? Did I get it? Yeah. That's the thing. I believe too many people out there try to convince us that technology is just amazing for humanity or just horrible for humanity. But the truth is technology is both. And I think we're entering a world where outcomes are changing based on technology to the extremes. Extreme negatives and extreme positives are getting amplified. We're beginning to enter a world where the average outcome is no longer the most common outcome. And that requires a complete departure from how we've been used to managing our worlds and also our companies. We've looked at disruption stories from all around the planet. And we notice that they tend to have 3 common denominators. In every single disruption story we looked at, somebody had invented a way for people, property, or information to move freely, more freely. That's what disruptors do. They invent these new mechanisms. We call this the golden triangle. At T-Labs, this is what we use to decide whether to work on a project or not. So I urge you to reflect on this for your own business model and also your own personal path forward. We think in a few years, you're not going to say that you are a bank, for example. You're going to say we're a technology company that does banking. You're not going to say you're an insurance company. You're going to say you're a technology company that does insurance. So what is that technology-first version of your organization? If you manage to disrupt yourself, there are a few things we can say about the future version of your organization. In terms of business dynamics, most likely you'll be managing fewer people but more information, data-driven decision-making. Fewer products and services offered as they get commoditized but more platforms. Chances are you will be a platform as well. Lower stability, but that is okay because you'll have higher revenue and higher impact. What about your growth thesis? We think every organization needs to have a chief adaptability officer. You don't need to call them that if you don't want to call them a CAO. But we need people who are intentional about noticing the change, making sense of the change, and also responding to the change, because too much is happening. Think about the operating system version of your business model. Now is the time to think about it before things like the BlakeNet show up. Run experiments. You're probably overestimating the cost of running these experiments in domains outside of your field and underestimating how quickly an innovation from an outside field can come in and disrupt your world. I always say the easiest way to think outside the box is to not know where the box is. So you have a competitive advantage in playing outside your field. You need to exercise it. All right. As an economist, it is very uncool for me to end on a positive note. I have to warn you about something. But the truth is, I'm very optimistic. I think we're headed towards an amazing world. But there's one area that I worry about. And that is a crisis of imagination. A crisis of imagination. The truth is, because of these technologies, our reach exceeds our imagination. We can all do much more than we realize, but most of us don't realize it. Today, the biggest risk is not thinking big enough. Not thinking big enough. And when you do think bigger, a few things will happen. I want to share with you my favorite quote of all time. Intelligence is hitting a target that nobody else can. Genius is hitting a target that nobody else can see. Realize that when you go out there and you try to disrupt yourself, for a while, people are not going to realize the target you're trying to hit. It will feel lonely. It'll be strange. It will feel impossible. Which is why I love what happened to me last year. I had a Samsung Galaxy S7. You guys remember that phone? Not the one that explodes, the other one. On this phone, I was typing the word impossible when my phone auto-corrected it to I'm possible. And on that note, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Amin, you always cover so much interesting territory, and I know we have a lot of questions we would like to address with you. So I think we have a few minutes to take a couple of them.
All right.
If you're ready.
Absolutely. Let's
All
jump
right.
in.
Let's do it.
So let me fix my hair first.
All right.
Yes, sir.
I think a lot of us are fascinated with this theme of adaptability, and we've been having kind of a running conversation throughout the day about the development of human capital. And could you describe and recommend some concrete strategies for developing adaptability in the workforce?
Yeah. So we can do an exercise together, actually, because this is a topic that we're quite interested in. I want you to think about your own personal AQ score. Assume that it is a number from 0 to 100, normally distributed. Think about it for a second, and I'll have a question for you. All right, we've done this exercise enough times to know that in a room like this, the average person, the average of the room actually, is around 70. But notice that I said normally distributed, average around 50. So we all tend to think of ourselves as more adaptable than we actually are. We tend to overestimate it. But here's a positive note about this exercise. This very exercise in our study has been shown to increase adaptability. So you just boosted your own AQ by going through this exercise. So first step is reflecting on the notion, and having it top of mind we think has predictive power for how well you can embrace it. But secondly, I've done a TED Talk on this. We think adaptive behavior starts in a concept that we call ligometry, knowledge of lack of knowledge. Ligo is Latin for shadow, metry is quantification. Ligometry is knowledge of lack of knowledge, quantifying things you know you don't know. There's knowledge pretension out there, and we all tend to project more knowledge than we actually have. And this goes a little deeper on the TED Talk, but effectively we do this exercise with executives, for instance, where we sit around a circle and we ask people to talk about things they know they don't know. And nobody wants to open their mouth. It's a bit of a career-ending move to talk about things you don't know, especially in a professional setting. So we put the CEO or the most senior person in the room on the spot, and we ask them to go first. That exercise, the moment that person goes first, it becomes a safe environment, going back to the safety of the environment. And suddenly everybody wants to share. So going through this knowledge of lack of knowledge and reflecting on it, I think is the first step.
All right, now I may be enabling you to end on that cooler note for the economists by opening this question up. But one thing that I feel like only surfaces here and there throughout your conversation on economics is the role of governance and policymakers. And generally when it does surface, it seems to not be too optimistic of a take. But could you tell us a little bit more about how you see governments responding to these economic changes? And what do you think the likely response is, and what do you think the preferred response would be?
I love that question. I think you're astute in your observation that governments have not been doing a great job. And I tend to think of governments as reactive as opposed to proactive when it comes to this stuff. A government, to me, epitomizes the classic tension between the urgent and the important. And governments almost always have to choose the urgent, right? The important is rarely. There's not enough time for that. But here's the part that gives me hope. We talk about the cascading effect of technological empowerment, the fact that people are doing what companies used to do, and companies are doing what governments used to do. What are governments doing? Not a whole lot, but they have to compete with each other for the first time, like companies do. What are they competing for? Talent and capital. Because talent and capital is moving much faster, much more freely. And governments realize that it's very possible, for example, for them to overregulate blockchain and completely miss out on the innovation, or overregulate AI and completely miss out on the innovation. In the United States, stem cell research was blocked during the Bush era. It didn't stop, it simply moved to China and other parts of the world. So similarly, governments are really worried about that. And I think that is healthy. It pushes them to embrace the important rather than just getting tunnel vision on the urgent.
All right, and with that, Amin, I think we're about out of time. Thank you so much, as always.
All right,
Pleasure
thank
to have
you.
you.
Thank you, everybody.